It's all in the name. Northwood. Don't overthink it. When Northwood's charter members were trying to come up with a name, they decided to simply name it after the woods that, at that time, stood on the northern outskirts of Indianapolis. You can read about the story in a book that was put together in the 90s called The Story of Northwood. And it goes that in February of 1920, two men, Carmen L. Thomas and Harry Yockey, quote, departed the Central Avenue trolley at 42nd Street to look for a site for a new church. And again quoting, in 1920, there was as yet no disciples' church in the northeast area of the city. Thomas later wrote that as they walked, they were surveying several sites, considering the future growth about them, their size, etc. Finally, arriving at 46th and Central, they liked the beech trees, the woods, the size. By the middle of May, they and other disciples in the neighborhood began meeting to organize a church and plan for a place of worship. For several months, they met in the home of Dr. and Mrs. George Wood at 3941 Broadway. Northwood's founding members met near this spot to worship for the first time under a tent in August of 1920, so I guess it's fitting that we are celebrating under a tent today. You may have noticed just how localized this story has been thus far. The names and addresses contained in the telling of Northwood's beginning are all from blocks away. They lived near here and these events happened here. Today, many of Northwood's congregants arrive on a Sunday after a 20 or 30-minute drive, and some even further. It was not this way in the beginning. As you can see from a glance at the directory of Northwood's charter members, nearly all of them resided just blocks away from 46th and Central. This was a neighborhood church. Again, quoting from the Story of Northwood. Nearly all of Northwood's charter members were newcomers to the area and lived within a few blocks of the church. I like that idea. People walking to church from their homes. Northwood would soon build its first building, which once stood on the lot at the southeast corner of 46th and Central. It was commissioned on May 1st, 1921. Again, quoting from the Story of Northwood, the church grew rapidly to 279 members by 1930. A decade later, with 350 members taxing the facilities of their first building, Northwood began to think about a new building on a larger site. Moving across the street to the lot once owned by the Indianapolis School Board, a new building was ready in 1950 for the growing membership of 674. But the new building did not spring up overnight, out of nowhere, and without numerous leaps of faith. First came a concerted fundraising effort which called Northwood's members to give generously. When Northwood broke ground, the full dollar amount was yet to be raised. This great undertaking was not unlike other moments in church history when disciples were called to take steps forward into an uncertain future in faith. From the November 1949 newsletter, I quote, "When does the contractor expect to complete the construction?" In answer, "The estimate of occupancy has been set as nearly as June 1950, all circumstances being favorable." Next question, "When can we dedicate this building?" Answer, "The dedication must be deferred until we have assurance of sufficient funds in hand or pledge to pay the contractor." I don't know if you caught that, but in short, basically, it is saying the building was being built before the funds were well in order. Here is an example of a community stepping out in faith in pursuit of an inspired vision, but it gets better still. Quoting from the Story of Northwood again, In Theo Fisher's sermon on the morning of December 7th, 1952, Fisher reminded the congregation of the significance of that day in 1941 when, quote, "the nation was united in a sense of mission such as it had never been before." He had recently returned from a visit to Pearl Harbor and was so moved that he had resolved to challenge his church to, quote, "a new and greater sense of mission." Just 2 years in its new building and already planning for an additional wing, Fisher said he wanted to tell them, quote, "that I have a guilty conscience." Northwood and others, he said, had become too occupied building our new churches. His challenge? "The vision that has come to me was the dream that Northwood accept a goal of $100,000 to be paid by 1958 to be over the regular missionary giving." He reminded the congregation that they were committed to pay $158,000 over the next 3 years for their present building. He promised them, if they accepted this challenge and this dream, that the soul of this church will grow. His words. There will come a time when members will say, "I was a part of the church during these glorious days of adventure for the kingdom of God." Just in case you missed what happened, Northwood raised funds to build a church in the Congo in addition to the funds raised for our own sanctuary and the extension of our educational wing. Remember, we did not yet have the money in hand for the completion of our educational wing when we made this commitment, yet still we were challenged to journey out into a visionary future yet to be actualized. How if the vision never came alive? Well, moot point from where we stand now, for the vision did come alive. The above quotes were pulled from a chapter in the history of Northwood called The Glory Years. And I bring this up to make a theological point. Our glory years did not fall from the sky. They did not form around us for no reason. Our glory years were experienced when Northwood was outward focused and missional. Our glory years were discovered in the context of an uncertain journey into our own version of a promised land yet to be realized. How if we caught the vision again? We must. We are, by God's grace. In the decades to follow, time would march on as it does, but so did the people. People marched in the 60s and 70s for a variety of reasons, perhaps most significantly for civil rights and justice for people of color. But there were a variety of issues at hand. These were contentious times, and Northwood was involved. But conflict within communities and the congregation was not at all unusual. Again, quoting from the Story of Northwood, "The Cold War brought open conflict within Northwood. The anti-communist crusade of Senator Joseph McCarthy in the early 1950s was followed by attacks on the National Council of Churches and other religious leaders for being, quote, soft on communism." This was, of course, a big problem for Northwood, as its pastor, Theo Fisher, and many of its leaders had made Christian unity and interdenominational cooperation between diverse Christian communities a priority. Christian ministers joined the throngs of voices in criticizing cooperation between Christian ecclesial bodies, to which Reverend Theo Fisher responded in the Northwood News: "The slanderous and indiscriminate attacks made on the National Council of Churches needs setting straight." Reverend Fisher's defense of Christian unity in the face of red baiting came at a cost. The controversy continued, and in 3 years, between 1964 and 1966, 160 members asked for letters of transfer to other churches in the city. We are glad that Reverend Fisher took a stand in this regard, as it set the stage for decades of interdenominational work at Northwood. Perhaps most notably, were the efforts of Paul Crow Jr., who became a tireless advocate for Christian unity in the decades to come. When the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1964, Northwood became personally involved in the struggle for civil rights. Churches were asked to send members to the South to stand with African Americans at voting registration offices. Theo Fisher and his good friend and minister at Downey Avenue Christian Church, William Weigman, signed on. Going first to Birmingham for training, they were assigned to the city of Hattiesburg and stayed there in a safe house. They went door to door encouraging black people to register to vote. Upon their return, Fisher gave a full report and remembers that the church was most supportive. Most supportive, we have come to learn, does not signify full support. Brave decisions were made by the pastoral and lay leadership to ensure that the social issues of the day were met with a Christian witness from Northwood, whatever the cost. And Northwood did lose members during this time because of these efforts. In 1968, Northwood would hire its longest-stayed minister, Reverend John Hennett, as our Minister of Education. For many of you, he needs no introduction. For 3 decades, he taught our children and youth, educating them and modeling for them a Christian witness. In the 1970s, the full inclusion of women in ministerial leadership roles went hand in hand with demands for women's full inclusion in our society's leadership structures. Northwood during this time sought to make the leadership structure at Northwood more equitable, and women began to fill in at roles as elder and deacon and then eventually pastors. In the 1980s, leadership and members of Northwood raised their voices in opposition to apartheid in South Africa. In recent decades, the full inclusion of LGBTQ persons has been taken up in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ as a denomination at large, and at Northwood specifically. Northwood has continued on its trajectory of being a church that is open and willing to include all of the diversity of God's children in full fellowship and communion. And there is so much we could say at this point. The decades have flown by, and there are so many things that I haven't mentioned. For example, I was once told that Northwood's music programs were the pride of the city. People would visit from all over town to experience the ecstasy of music and high art. Legends of the trade led the way. James Lamberson, Lee Barlow, Sharon Watson, and A. Paul Johnson, to name a few. Many of you will remember singing in those vocal and handbell choirs on high holy days, Christmas and Easter, hanging of the greens in December, and shouts of "He is risen" in springtime. Our tradition of service to the needy carries into our present day by way of our food pantry. For decades, Northwood has fed the hungry in partnership with Meridian Heights Presbyterian Church, Westfield Friends Church, and others. In the summer of 2020, once the pandemic had set in, its current director, Connie Slater, adapted to the necessary safety protocols and shifted to a curbside service. This way, we've continued to feed hundreds of families in dire times. During the Christmas of 2020, Northwood held a Christmas Eve service outside, open to the community. By way of a radio transmitter, community members and congregants alike enjoyed carols and readings from the safety and warmth of their vehicles. Christmas trees were donated by the community and set up as a wintry festive backdrop. This unique and adaptive service provided a pocket of joy after a long and bleak year. Light broke through the darkness. Over the course of decades, Northwood was built on a vision and by bravely engaging the issues of the day. This was a church that found its life as it engaged the pressing issues that surrounded it, even when those issues were divisive and difficult to sort through. The same can be said of us today. Things have changed and are changing, I don't need to tell you. Northwood's membership has declined in most recent decades, following national trends as they relate to church attendance and involvement. This sense of loss has also accompanied a sense of anxiety about the future. These memories we've shared are the glue that bound us together, but they also remind us of what we've lost. But in recent years, Northwood has adapted and continued to reach outside of its four walls to discover in what ways we might participate in God's life-giving work in the world. The way forward has seldom seemed obvious, but in the meantime, we have been led subtly by God's Spirit to streams of living water. Over the past decade, Northwood has welcomed many tenants into our building. We have become quite an eclectic community. If you were to arrive in the middle of the week, you would discover that our building is very busy. Caterers have gotten their start in our commercially licensed kitchen. Yoga and body movement studios have helped hundreds to arrive at a greater sense of health and physical well-being and spiritual well-being. Our old choir room, once filled with music and singing, more recently collecting dust, has been changed into an art and pottery studio for children. Right next door to that is a dojo where children learn karate. The Indianapolis Women's Chorus is housed here. Mental health therapists and counselors, preschools, a school for especially gifted students. And in recent years, we've begun a partnership with IPS 70 to host their yearly fundraiser, Global Fest. All this to say, our ever-expanding community at Northwood truly runs the gambit. In fact, in recent years, we have given this new iteration of life at Northwood a name: the Center for Faith and Community at Northwood. As I've poured through the archives of Northwood's past, I've been inspired by the vision cast by the leaders of Northwood, especially through the 50s and 60s. What new challenges face us today? Well, seemingly many of the old ones: racism, sexism, poverty. The vision of our forebears must guide us still. We hope to remain and still become an inclusive community that advocates for justice in the name of Jesus. It was not uncommon for this church's most revered pastor, Theo Fisher, to write down his dreams, hopes, visions, and aspirations for Northwood and then print them in newsletters or talk about his hopes from the pulpit. So here goes. Here are some words that I wrote about my hopes for Northwood. I see a church that believes that the gospel of Jesus calls all peoples to life and everything good. I see a church that tells the Christian story, a story that gives us reason to hope in the face of every obstacle and challenge. In a culture where Christianity has been weaponized and used to exclude others, I pine for a church that strives to reclaim our story by partnering with persons of every kind to bridge our divisions, by striving to build a more inclusive community, and by loving and leading others back to life. In short, I hope that Northwood might reclaim the Christian story for the life of the world and anyone else we should meet. 100 years from now, I hope that others will tell our story and share our vision and be inspired.